There's a case of a landing in
A field in Missouri where the farmer
tried to walk toward the thing. He was mad because it was on his property without his permission. Honest to God. And he ran into an invisible wall. He couldn't get past a certain point. And again, he was angry. He threw a couple of rocks, and they didn't get past this invisible wall either. But I don't know how to explain that. You know, maybe they were controlling his brain. I don't know how that explains the rocks. But so it's one of the many mysterious aspects of this. Mysterious because we don't have much data, and we're not doing much to get the data. Yes? Oh, about anybody tried to interpret the patterns of flight as a means of communication? Very good question. Nobody that I know of. Interesting thought. I guess people who are... Talked to one Navy man. He was watching on a radar screen while a guy up above decks was watching as the craft did 5 right-angle turns in a row at 2,500 miles an hour. Now, he was so impressed with that he really wasn't thinking about, you know, what kind of patterns does it make, but how the heck is that happening? Which is, you know... And so I would love to see some of the footage. I met a different guy who worked in the Air Force whose job was to handle film taken of radar scopes on B-52s. They have a means of photographing the scope. And every once in a while, he get handed a roll of film by a pilot saying it's UFO film. And he did see one set of this that was developed. It was sent off to a secret place. And there were a bunch of right-angle turns. So it's that kind of film that you'd really like to look at. You know, and see if it makes any sense, whether they're spelling the alphabet or whatever you want. Coca-Cola ads, you know, anything you like. Yes? Oh, but that, you see, you seem to be implying that they're here to find out about us.
Well, the question is, whatever they're looking for, you know.
Oh, okay. I mean, really, it's like all the cartoons. You know, take me to your leader kind of thing. And why haven't they done that? I think there's an obvious reason. In the first place, because there's no leader to be taken to for the planet Earth. I mean, President Nixon may have some notions about being the spokesman for the planet, and maybe Mao and Kosygin have their own notions. But there really is no leader in the first place. In the second place, I could be facetious and say, how many scuba divers talk to the fish? You know, are we really worth talking to? And if you say we try to communicate with dolphins, you know how we do it. We go off and grab ourselves a dolphin and bring him back to the laboratory. Betty and Barney were picked up, thrown back. Be kind to dumb animals week sort of thing. I think that anybody coming here for whatever purposes, and I'll give you a long list of purposes in just a minute, would abide by rule number 1. Make sure you can get home. I mean, whatever his purpose for coming here, that has to be some consideration. That being the case, you got to find out enough about the natives to avoid winding up in the zoo, the morgue, the jail, or whatever. That's no sweat at all when the natives only have, you know, bows and arrows and shotguns. You see them coming, you leave. But when the natives wind up with radar, missiles, supersonic airplanes, and atomic bombs, as we did after the Second World War shortly, then it becomes a bit more of a problem to find out enough about the natives to avoid them. And so there are many indications, like that RB-47 cases, of them traipsing along besides our sophisticated craft to find out what's going on. And I think some of these tests on cars and stuff are related to the same sort of thing. Now, anybody studying enough about us to fulfill that purpose, I think would immediately decide, or at least it wouldn't take very long, after picking up our radio signals and our television signals and running them through a computer, that this society here on planet Earth is a very primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare. And why get involved in the tribal warfare? It's perfectly clear every Air Force here would love to grab himself a UFO, you know, deliver weapons. And just as I don't give my small children guns to play with, they're irresponsible. And just as we, the Air Force, say, doesn't grab the Aborigines and take them into the Minuteman missile launch sites and says, play with the buttons, fellas, I wouldn't expect them to say, to land in Times Square, because they're not going to get off without clobbering an awful lot of people. And I wouldn't expect them to call a meeting and say, hey, fellas, we'll show you how these things work, invite the Russians while you're at it. That's not the way our world operates. So I would consider that they're here for their own purposes. And, occasionally an anthropologist comes along who wants to do a thesis research project, and so he needs 10 specimens of earthlings to study, like Betty and Barney, for example. But let me throw out some reasons for coming here. I mentioned before they might be mining engineers. This is the densest planet in the solar system. I don't mean the people. That may be true too, but the planet itself is the densest. The average cubic foot of Earth weighs more than the average cubic foot of any other planet in the solar system. Saturn is so light you could float it if you had a big bowl of water. It's lighter than water. What this means is there's more heavy metals here than any place else. You'd have a hard time finding any rhenium, osmium, platinum, gold, uranium, these heavy metals, any place, say like Jupiter, never find any. Here's the place. They could be here as graduate students doing their thesis research on the development of a primitive species. They could be here as cameramen for an extraterrestrial comedy or tragedy, depending on one's viewpoint. They could be specimen gatherers for the local zoo out someplace. They could be here because we're somebody's colony, somebody's crop. This could be the booby prize in intergalactic competition. This could be the rest and relaxation center of this corner of the galaxy, R&R on Earth. This could be the honeymoon capital for all I know. In other words, there could be as many reasons for them coming here as there are for people flying from Des Moines to London. There must be some people that do that. Now, the cost is a relative thing. Let me say Los Angeles to London, since I live near Los Angeles. And there are regular flights every day. If you had suggested 100 years ago that there would be regular, trips back and forth there, people would have said, you're out of your mind. It takes 6 months to get there. Now, terribly expensive. Very few people can afford it. Routine today. Athletes flying all over the place. Actors, lecturers, all kinds of people go for all sorts of reasons. And only a small part of it is anthropological. As some of the astronomers have suggested that why would anybody come to this place out in the galactic boondocks? After all, when a group down in the Andaman Islands develops a new kind of net, we don't have all the world's anthropologists going over there to check on it. Well, frankly, in all my flying, I've never run across an anthropologist. I would suggest that there isn't an airline around that has any substantial part of its business flights by anthropologists. They're businessmen and all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons. I think we're in the same boat as the American Indian must have been a couple of hundred years ago, trying to understand what the heck all these foreigners were coming here for. Englishmen and Frenchmen and Spaniards and Russians and Portuguese and Dutch, good guys, bad guys, curers, killers, all sorts. And can you imagine the views of the natives on the islands in the Pacific during the Second World War? As we and the Japanese built big forts there and had all kinds of battles and fleet sails up to the island, it wasn't because of the natives at all. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, so may we. So I'd like to find out what they want, what some of them want, what all of them want, whether there are bad guys amongst them too. But we don't know. That's one reason for studying them. Yes? What? Have I ever personally sighted a UFO? I always get asked that question. I have a canned answer. No, I have never seen a UFO. But I spent 14 years in industry chasing neutrons and gamma rays, and I never saw one of them either. And I think they're real too. Seeing is believing sounds good, but it really isn't how we base our beliefs about the world at all. I've never seen Australia. I think it's there. Yes? Very easily. What's tremendous acceleration? Well, if you study the body's ability to stand acceleration under special reasonably controlled conditions, spacesuits, properly restrained and all this sort of thing, you find a couple of interesting phenomena. You find that the shorter the duration of the acceleration, the more you can stand. You find that trained people under appropriate restraints can stand, say, 1 G forever. We all can. 2 Gs for weeks. 5 Gs for 5 minutes. Actually, 6 minutes. This depends on which direction the force acts on the body and a lot of other things. You can stand 10 Gs for many seconds. You can stand 50 Gs for a fraction of a second, or at least 39. It's been stood. What does this mean? Well, if you saw a system accelerating in linear flight at 5 Gs, you'd say it was impossible. 5 Gs is 105 miles per hour per second increase in velocity, or decrease for that matter. That means at the end of 5 seconds, the thing's going 500 miles an hour. Well, none of the systems we commonly see, cars, planes, trains, horses, anything like that, come anywhere near 5 Gs in linear flight. A good drag racer will pull about 1 G and 2/3, under 2 Gs. That's a really fancy dragster. And so normal airplanes just don't accelerate that way. That's the first thing. What looks impossible because we're unaccustomed to it isn't impossible at all. The second thing is it appears that if you could get enough force for a short enough period of time, it wouldn't matter what the G level is because the body doesn't have a chance to react to it. This is what I call the hot potato syndrome. If you got a hot potato in the oven, you just baked potatoes, and you don't have a fork around it, and you want to get it out of the oven, you grab it, and you want to do something with it. Do you get burned or don't you? Well, it obviously depends on how long you're foolish enough to hold on to the potato for. There's a finite time. If you get rid of it in a hurry, you don't get burned. Well, it seems that for the body, you'd have the same situation as you do for all physical things, really. And that time we're talking about is something like the time for a sound wave to go through the body, fraction of a second. This means mechanically you'd have trouble doing this, but electromagnetically we can switch on huge forces in very short periods of time. Millionths of a second, billionths of a second. And we do this routinely. Physicists in the laboratory are kicking particles around. We don't push them physically. We act on them at a distance with fields. And switching times, microseconds. There are lasers around that produce 1 billion watts for 1 billionth of a second. Has a very, very different effect than if you had 1 watt for 1 second. Same 1 watt second, but it makes a very big difference for how long and at what level. And so if these things are electromagnetically propelled, then we might very well expect that there would be sudden changes of direction as you switch fields, and that these would take place in extremely short periods of time. And so the case I described with the 600 mile an hour, starting and stopping kind of thing, would seem to fit right in this ballpark. They don't accelerate at a high rate for a long time, but rather their speed is a step function. 0 and then 600 with that time interval being extremely short. I'd very much like to see framing camera measurements of UFO accelerations. So what I'm saying is several things, that present systems aren't designed to provide big accelerations. Big deal. We don't build present systems if we want to duplicate UFO behavior. But present systems can withstand huge accelerations by normal standards for short periods of time. The Apollo astronauts, the escape tower is designed to provide 12 Gs to get them away if something happens down below. 12 Gs is a heck of an acceleration. So we have to look at things in the proper perspective. And we have to throw out, I can't build wristwatch radios with vacuum tubes. Microcircuits, no sweat. Large-scale integrated circuits. Yeah. You wonder if there are any existing radar networks that what? Yes, and they do. Yeah. One of the guys who testified at the congressional hearings, Dr. Robert M.L. Baker, had stopped at a new radar installation on his way to the hearings. And had they picked up any UFOs? Yes. A brand new installation. The kicker, of course, is that you have a computerized system attached to the radar to kick out anything that doesn't match the limits of what you're looking for. Russian airplanes, missiles, and so forth. They have to do this, otherwise they'd be stuck with worrying about every bird that flies around. And so UFOs don't meet the criteria for Russian missiles. You know, it takes a certain time to get from point A to point B. And if it doesn't take within that certain fraction of that time, then it's not a Russian missile. And so the UFO data is apparently lost to the system. Although I would bet anything that the Air Defense Command has been gathering such data for ages. I've talked to several former Air Defense Command radar operators who tell me of sightings that occurred while they were in the service and that the security lid was clamped down on afterward. So the answer is, yes, there are radar sets. Normal FAA radar isn't designed for this at all. They worry about the airplanes with transponders on them, which gives them enough trouble. There are sets. They do pick up UFOs. We ain't getting the whole story. Yes? Well, I can only speculate. Obviously, I'm not speaking for the government here, but I mean, I want to make that perfectly clear that I am not a government spokesman on UFOs. The best guess I would give is that 18 years ago, they decided that these things were real, weren't from Earth. We didn't need to worry about the Germans, Russians, Japanese, anybody else. That was a big decision. That we ought to try to figure out how they work, that we ought to set up a secret project to do that, because if we were to develop one, what a great weapon system of all sorts. That we certainly don't want to tell the Russians that we're doing that we really couldn't care less about what Joe Blow sees out on the street, you know, while standing out in the street, because we've got the airplanes, the radar sets, the instrument platforms, the gun cameras, to get all the data we need, that is through the Air Defense Command. And so Blue Book becomes a cover story, which I think is what it's been for the last 18 years, without even knowing that it was. That's the best kind of cover. And they're working on this secret program to figure out how, why, where, all these other things. And even if they developed it, and if one had crashed, and I've heard all these stories about one's crashing, that's certainly you don't want to tell anybody about it. And so you've got the best situation where you're doing your work, the public is misdirected, meaning your not so friendly friends across the ocean are misdirected as well. The laughter curtain is a very effective way of convincing people that this is nonsense, we're not taking it seriously. So I'm not saying I buy that as the right thing to do, but I know there's plenty of past history to justify that viewpoint. When the first atomic bomb blast went off in New Mexico, a newspaper story came out because people saw it from 100 miles away. They said it was an ammunition dump had blown up, and fortunately nobody was hurt. That was the cover story. One of the reasons the British won the Battle of Britain, the airplane battle, was that the British had radar and the Germans didn't know the British had radar. Every time they sent airplanes over, there was a bunch of British fighter planes. It didn't matter where they went. Well, the Germans figured that every place they went there were lots of planes. And that wasn't the way it was. They had darn few planes, but they knew where the Germans were going. And they even put out a cover story. It's been rumored that one could develop a system for detecting planes at a distance. Of course, that was nonsense. Harry Truman didn't know about the Manhattan Project, development of the atomic bomb, while he was vice president of the United States. It was only after President Roosevelt died and he became president that somebody bothered to tell him. So we have a long history of this sort of thing. The problem is it's the same government that that pulled the Bay of Pigs nonsense, that told people 8 years ago that with 100,000 more troops in 1 year we'd be finished in Vietnam, a whole bunch of other such things. And I don't know whether I want to trust them or not. I'm not at all sure that I want to entrust the world's future in their hands. Yeah. Any possibility that UFOs are a product of Earth-based technology? I would be certain that some of them are. I'm certain, I feel, that Earthlings observing some of the early flights of our secret systems would misinterpret those. A lot of people didn't know we had Mach 3 or 4 airplanes until after 2 years of flying them around. But I can't explain the majority, especially of the early unknowns, from all over the world in clusters of 10 or 12 things going 3,000 miles an hour in 1947 by terrestrial technology. If you mean a secret civilization, well, okay, I don't know of any such secret civilization. But I would almost include that as almost extraterrestrial, if we didn't know that the civilization existed. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, is that any other light to share or to shed on this explosion that was possible
Tunguskaya in 1908. Do I have any light to shed on that huge explosion? I guess is as good a word as anything. Yes and no. I just finished a couple of Russian articles that have been translated. You know, this happened in this huge release of energy, and trees got knocked down for 20 years, 20 miles around. Shock waves registered on equipment around the world, which we today interpret as equivalent energies to H-bomb energies. That doesn't mean it was an H-bomb, it's just the same energy was released. There's been all sorts of speculation. Originally it was thought it was a meteor, except there's no crater, and there's no hunks of meteor, which if you go out to Barringer Canyon or crater in Arizona, you always find hunks of meteors in a big hole in the ground. And so there have been all sorts of suggestions made. There have been a couple of recent Russian expeditions out there. There is increased radioactivity, it is believed, corresponding to that year in the tree rings. If you check back at each year, there's more in that year than before or after. Some people have interpreted this and other data as an indication that A, it was somebody's H-bomb, B, it was somebody's spacecraft with matter and antimatter which exploded somehow, C, that it was a comet that hit the Earth, and there's several other possible explanations. One of the peculiar things is that the data seems to indicate that the thing made a right-angle turn. They get a bunch of witnesses watching it go north, and then a bunch saying it went east, but nobody, and then back west again. And I read the discussion of this, and it was funny. One guy says, that's just the aerodynamics, forget all this nonsense. Other people saying, yeah, it must have been an artificial craft. So I don't think it's been resolved. It's an interesting problem. It's way out in the boonies. I mean, that's really far from anywhere in Siberia. And so it is a very hard thing to investigate. People aren't making expeditions up there very often. It's a hell of a place to do research. Not that I know of. There are all kinds of rumors like that around. And there was increased radiation apparently in the right rings of the trees. But I know of no bodies that had been exhumed that died of radiation poison. It would be an interesting thing to find out, yeah. Be very exciting, as a matter of fact. But not that I know of. Of course, that wouldn't, again, tell you motivation or whether it was artificial or natural or whatever, but it would be interesting to know, certainly. Yeah, there was, yes? You mean, why did they finally find somebody? Well, it wasn't so much psychiatric help. It wasn't. They were recommended by the first two guys that who figured out there was a time lapse, that they see a psychiatrist who used regressive hypnosis, because it is well recognized that if it was a sufficiently traumatic event that they didn't remember what happened, that you're dealing with tremendous emotional problems in getting out that event. The guy they went to eventually, who was recommended to them by their own psychiatrist, and there was a delay because he said, well, let's wait and it'll come back. You'll gradually remember. The amnesia will wear off, was suggested to them. That was part of the reason for the delay. The reason that they finally did go was that Barney was having ulcer problems. And it was thought that they would kind of kill two birds with one stone. That is, ulcer problems usually react to psychiatry. And so Betty went along just because their original guy, their doctor who recommended them eventually to Dr. Simon, said that he ought to see both of them on this regressive hypnosis bit. And frankly, listening to the tapes, I was very glad that they were with Dr. Simon, who had handled hundreds of shell-shock war veterans with regressive hypnosis and was accustomed to handling this tremendous terror. You know, the kind of thing we're dealing with here is where a guy is fighting in the battle lines and his buddy's head gets blown off. Well, that's pushed aside in one's mind, and he has problems, but he doesn't remember what happened. It's just wiped out. And so when you have them relive that experience, it's obviously in a very emotionally upsetting kind of thing. And so, in other words, if the event causes you to repress it, then you better have somebody around who knows how to handle the emotional release that comes out when you relive it. And so there was nothing crazy or whatever. Psychiatrists treat normal people, as the saying goes. And they went for 7 months, which is, they were certainly not in psychoanalysis or anything like that. So I talked to Dr. Simon a couple weeks ago about this and on the phone. And he had accomplished the job. Barney's ulcer was cured. They were people doing their job in society. Betty is still a social worker for the state of New Hampshire, a supervisor. Barney was on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission. Perfectly respectable people. He's got citations from the governor. I've seen them. And so the time delay, there's nothing mysterious about it, nothing hidden about they'd gone off the deep end or anything like that at all. It was just time to get to find out what happened, and the ulcers provided a convenient excuse for doing that. Yes? It's been done a couple times. Dr. Hynek sat in on a session with just him, Betty, Barney, and Dr. Simon. And he asked them questions. He describes this in his book. I don't know whether Dr. Simon would be willing to do it again or not. I would like to be there when it happens, and I've thought about approaching a couple of the other guys who'd like to ask some questions to see about it. The writing in the book and all kinds of other things to ask them. You see, one of the problems was Dr. Simon didn't know anything about UFOs when he started on this. When he gets these two independent experiences, he goes to several of his colleagues with the tapes and says, hey, what am I doing wrong? How could I possibly get this kind of thing? So they were very fortunate in that he retained his objectivity. He didn't say, what happened to you on the night you saw the flying saucer? It was, what happened on the night of September 19th? And Barney politely recites, every little thing they did until he blocks when they get to the UFO. And then you hear the terror as Simon very carefully drags this out of him, step by step, but having Barney do it. Well, you see, he induces amnesia after each session. So they don't know what they've been told. Okay, then he plays the tapes back for them after months of this, much to their astonishment, to say the least. And so there is a certain memory now, yes. Barney's gone, we can't check on him. And actually, Simon always preferred to use Barney as a better subject rather than Betty for the redoing, for demonstrations before professional groups and that sort of thing. And so I don't know whether, we try this again or not. But Betty has some memories now. But of course, the problem, you see, is once you've told the story and you've heard it, then how much does that color your memory? When it first came out, it's pristine. It's not sullied by retelling. You haven't heard it before, and you're reliving rather than retelling. But once you've heard the tape, then that's already back in your system. And so there's a fine line there. He was satisfied. They were satisfied. They stopped. As I say, if you hear those tapes, that's not the kind of emotional experience one wants to go through. It really isn't. Yes? Yeah. What qualifications do you need? To be able to follow instructions and learn enough astronomy to be able to interpret the 3 coordinates for stars. Actually, she had a college degree. She had taken some courses in astronomy. She learned a hell of a lot, spent thousands of hours. She's a member of Mensa. She's a very bright gal. She's single. She's a school teacher. She had time on her hands to spend this way. And she's had her models looked at by professional astronomers who've checked her out. She's done more work on this sort of thing. In other words, you don't even know anything about astrophysics, for example. It's descriptive astronomy, if you will. She went through catalogs and catalogs. She got help from Dr. Mitchell at Ohio State University and a couple of other astronomers who gave her access to the catalogs, who reviewed her data. Her original model is being used as a teaching tool at the Perkins Observatory of Ohio State University. And Dr. Mitchell, the guy, head of the department there, couldn't find anything to complain about the accuracy of the model. He had his students check it out. And so in terms of, did she take a course in model building of star systems? No, because nobody's ever offered such a course, and nobody had ever done one this big. She did a very sharp job of deciding how to put this thing together and all that sort of stuff. And she has constantly had professionals look at it to make sure she wasn't going off the deep end. Matter of fact, she didn't even believe the book when she first read it. because of the humanoids part. Then she read Jacques Vallée's book, many, many sightings of humanoids, went back, visited Betty, started on the model, built several models, finally found the stuff. She's one of the most objective researchers I've ever run across.
The slide that you showed was just one little part of it.
Oh, yeah, that was just one little model she'd made that just showed the map stars. That didn't show all of the stars at all in that region of space. But Dr. David Saunders at the University of Colorado has a computer code to handle the star catalogs in card file in computerized form. And he's checked around. And it's right on. Yeah, you know, a scale of like a 1/4 inch to a light year or something like that. It's kind of a weird scale, but it's real, yeah.
Has there ever been a pattern to the UFO sightings or a cycle or a period?
Well, there's cycles, certainly. It's certainly not uniform with time. There's about a 5-year peaking. 52, 57, 62, 67, 72 was a big year.
How about the mining in Missouri? Unfortunately, that was way overplayed. I have suggested on occasion that they might be mining engineers. The Earth happens to be the densest planet in the solar system. Heavy metals are hard to find in the rest of the solar system. There are lead mines not too far away. There was an expedition down there, Dr. Hynek, Ted Phillips, Walt Andrus, head of MUFON. Lights in the sky. No landings, no close approaches, lights in the sky, except for the case across the river at the big power plant, where very good reports from independent witnesses. One of them saw this thing go right overhead and sit over the 66,000 volt transformers, too. He got called by somebody else who said, go outside and look, and he went outside and looked, and sure enough, there it was. So that case was good, but the rest, Hayden News got carried away. Hayden is not too cautious in putting together facts with non-facts. So sorry about that. Other questions? Yes?
You mentioned a sighting within the last 2 weeks. Would you please elaborate?
Yeah, let me see if I can pin the date down. Make it 3 weeks. I've been traveling for a month, and I'm really lost. You know, I have to say what town am I in to know what day it is. But this case here, the sighting over the power plant was the 22nd. That's 3 weeks, I guess, of March. There were sightings the week before that in California. 3 boys standing overlooking the Pacific, and an object that came fairly close and then zipped off over the ocean. There were sightings in the early part of the year in South Carolina where a truck driver was followed several times, he said, by a UFO. He told people about it. Naturally, the reporters didn't believe him, so they drove in a truck behind him on his next trip. They saw it too. More lights in the sky, unfortunately. There were sightings in Milton, Pennsylvania, in Sudbury, Pennsylvania, in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, all within the past month. So I get a clipping service. Sightings go on steadily. Most sightings can be explained. I'm not trying to give any other impression than that. But this power plant case, not at all on that one. Yes? Any correlation between UFOs and the report in Ezekiel, where if you read that, you know, Ezekiel's wheel, you know, came down from the sky, craziest sounding thing you ever saw. I don't pretend to be a biblical scholar. I mean, I'm a physicist. I wish I knew more about the Bible. There are a couple of interesting books, besides Eric von Daniken's, which somebody's going to ask about sooner or later anyway. You know, Chariots of the Gods and Gods from Outer Space. I would much prefer on the biblical stuff a book called Flying Saucers in the Bible by Barry Downing, who's got a bachelor's in physics and a doctor of divinity. Divine physics is his beat, if you will. And he discusses Ezekiel and the pillar of fire by day and the cloud by night. I think this is a very fruitful area for scholarly research. Research that's been ignored in the past by and large. But it takes a special kind of background.
You need to know technology, and you need to know ancient languages, and you need to know anthropology and archaeology and all these things. So I won't rule out ufological explanations for many biblical things, but I won't say that they've been established either. In other words, I'd like to see some graduate students doing their thesis work on one small part of this, where they can plow very deep and very narrow for an extended period of time. It's not out of the question. There's one guy who's got his PhD in journalism on UFOs, another at the University of Wisconsin who finished one in history, another one at Northwestern University that just finished work in sociology on UFOs, and there's a third working in political science at the University of Hawaii. So any faculty advisors on research topics, Ezekiel's wheel, a whole bunch of other things in the Bible make very interesting study effort. Sodom and Gomorrah, I've looked at that a little more closely, and in several different translations, and it sounds like there's a laser in the early part of that story and an atom bomb explosion in the latter part of that story. Now, you certainly couldn't have expected somebody translating that in the 16th century or so to suggest laser or atom bomb. And most of the people today who would be great at translating it don't know anything about lasers and atom bombs. So we need this peculiar combination. So I think it's a good area to study. Probably there were UFO sightings back then. I'm not willing to say, was God an astronaut just yet. Maybe next year. Other questions? Yes?
You said that when an object approaches the speed of light, time slows down.
Yes.
Would that apply to light itself?
No. Light and objects are different. It's almost like we live in a universe in which, according to some people, there are three classes of objects, or things. Things is not even the right word. Phenomena. There are things with mass, people, neutrons, protons, tables, glasses of water, whatever, that can go as fast as you want, but still lower than the speed of light. That's a limit. And for those things, as they go faster and faster, time slows down. That's one class of phenomena. Electromagnetic phenomena are another class, which by definition go at the speed of light, no mass. Photons, electromagnetic waves, radio waves, all this sort of thing. There are some physicists who suggest that there's a third class, tachyons. We've given a name, we don't know whether they exist or not. Peculiar particles whose main peculiar characteristic is that they always go faster than the speed of light, and the lower limit for their velocity is the speed of light. Sort of like they're on the other side. Now, we don't know whether they exist or not. The equations don't seem to rule them out if you solve them in a certain way. They're very hard to look for. We don't know what their properties are. And all the systems rule out particles going faster than the speed of light. So as far as we know, light, by definition, travels at the speed of light, which can vary in different media to some extent. Yeah.
In other words, if you travel in an object that approaches the speed of light, you could travel from a star and reach, say, the Earth before the light started from that star.
No. No. In the time frame of reference of the guy watching, you would have taken longer time than the light took. Not much if you were going very fast. But in your frame of reference, the elapsed time, and after all, if you're a pilot or a passenger, that's all you care about. You don't really care about the time back home. So your family gets old while you stay young. And if you don't think anybody would volunteer for a trip like that, it's the gift of immortality by comparison to the real world. So yeah, as strange as it may sound, and it's been demonstrated many, many times in the laboratory. Last year, 2 guys carried atomic clocks around the world and checked them against ones back home, and sure enough, they didn't keep the same time. And the amount they didn't matched with Einstein's predictions. There may be even further out modes of travel. That is, the astronomers who don't believe in UFOs are talking about white holes, not black holes, white holes, where you go in at one space and time location and come out someplace else. Now that's really far out, and I don't know how to handle that. That's like if you want to get from this corner to this corner, if you were a little ant. The easiest way, you walk across here. Well, it's like bending space so that you go like that. I don't know how to do that. If I did, I wouldn't be here, I suppose. I'd be someplace else. I don't know where. Yes? Yeah, there are some smaller number of cases where people have talked about a really little guy kind of hairy and strong and kind of unpleasant. He doesn't like being grabbed by earthlings, to say the least. Kind of claws. And there are also some, the other type in this particular sequence of drawings was a humanoid looking, a person who looked pretty much like us, kind of grayish skin. That's the most frightening type, really, in some ways. There are others who will talk about Sasquatch, the Bigfoot reports from all over the world, the abominable snowman or whatever. Some people say, well, here's a strange creature, he must have come off a flying saucer. I don't really buy that kind of reasoning. We got two mysteries, let's solve each of them, but let's not assume that they're related because it's convenient to assume that. Yes, in the red. When the couple was taken on board the spaceship, how did they communicate? The leader of the group spoke accented English. Now, that's not surprising if you think about it. We put out all kinds of radio and television signals that could be run through a computer and translated. The others amongst themselves made sounds that were completely unintelligible to Betty and Barney. It didn't make any sense to them. Some mumbling sounds, a language they'd never even heard anything like. There also seemed to be some element of telepathy involved, or at least mind control. Now, whether this was mechanical, some kind of radio device, that touches the right frequencies, I don't know. They had no evidence for that. But it was, the leader didn't understand all the words in the English language. It was clear from some conversation with them. He didn't understand meaning. He had heard the word, but what does it mean is something else. But no clue as to what that other language was. There was also a book that Betty picked up. She wanted to take something with her to prove that this had happened. And he took it away from her before she left. She was very upset. But meanwhile, she looked at this, not really like any book she'd ever seen, but with some kind of markings on the pages. Again, nothing like any language that... And I've heard the tape where Dr. Simon is asking her, is it like Japanese or whatever? And it seems to be up and down, but not like anything she'd ever seen. Terribly frustrating to listen to those tapes, incidentally. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, under the circumstances. Yes? What's my opinion of George Adamski and the photographs in his book, The Flying Saucers Have Landed? George is dead, and it doesn't behoove me well to speak ill of the dead. George was a nice guy from the best I can tell. In his books, he describes his trips to Venus and to Saturn and all kinds of other places, the backside of the moon at least in Venus. And his descriptions of Venus and the backside of the moon couldn't have been challenged very well in the early 1950s. He brings back religious messages. He went for trips and stuff. Well, they can be challenged now because now we know something about the surface of Venus. We know something about the backside of the moon. And in both cases, he was very much off base. He said Venus was kind of a nice place to visit. Well, the temperature is only 860 degrees, and the atmospheric pressure is like 250 pounds per square inch, and it's carbon dioxide, and you wouldn't enjoy it one little bit up there. And the backside of the moon doesn't have forests of trees and things growing the way he said it did. So with that background, I would have to assume that at least some of the things that George said were untrue. Now, that doesn't establish that everything he said was untrue. And the difficulty is, how do you separate the fact from the fiction? To me, that's as difficult as getting the eggs back out of a cake that you've baked. They're there, but how do you get them back? No way that I know of. So I don't have a high opinion of George's description of space creatures or what it's like on other places. He had some interesting philosophy. I don't object to that. His books make interesting reading. Some of his followers are still around, and they keep urging me to believe that there are Saturnians around and Venusians, and I try to pin them down. Well, let's have a meeting. Well, they won't admit that they're from Venus or Saturn. Well, how do you know that they are? Well, they look like Venusians and Saturnians. Well, what do they look like? And well, that's how they look, is how these guys look. And you go through this for a little while, and you give up. And so I think his pictures were probably fraudulent. They're certainly not very exciting pictures because there's no background to them. Nothing you can compare them to. So if you want an encounter with extraterrestrials, read The Interrupted Journey. It's in most libraries. It's out of print, but There could be a movie on it. James Earl Jones has the movie rights. He would play Barney. And it could be quite a movie. Yeah. Okay, the question was that most UFOs are moving at high speed, and yet they're silent. Has there ever been any case of their breaking a sonic boom? There have been some cases, or making a sonic boom. There have been some cases of loud noises, sonic boom type noises associated with UFOs, but I would take as a general statement that typically their flight, even when at very high speeds, does not include sonic boom production. Now, there are at least two ways to look at that. The first is, it can't have been real because if you were going that fast, you'd make a sonic boom and forget the whole business. The second is, hey, some clever guy has figured out how to go fast without making a sonic boom. Let's study them to find out how. I prefer the latter approach. Also, you see, it's a temptation to think that sonic boom production is an automatic phenomena associated with going rapidly. That's not really true. The strength, direction, etc. of a sonic boom is directly related to how you go that fast and in what you go that fast. That is, for airplanes propelled the way they are, you expect sonic booms. For completely differently shaped objects propelled in an entirely different fashion, especially if you control boundary layer flow, ionized air, electromagnetic fields, and directing the flow, you might very well expect not to produce sonic booms. The simplest analogy to think of is that if you remember the old desk calculators, they clanked away. You know, you were multiplying or dividing, you sit there and listen to the thing bang away and slowly record the numbers. Is noise production a necessary part of doing a calculation rapidly? No. Anybody who's seen the HP 35s, those delightful little toys, not so cheap as toys, but they're really wonderful things, does all sorts of calculations, doesn't make any noise at all. Because you're not doing it the same way that the old desk calculators do it. You use 3 little chips this big instead of wheels and gears and so forth. So the sonic boom production is one of the reasons you assume that they don't work the way airplanes do. But everything else tells you that anyway. So not many reports, but that isn't very upsetting. It should be exciting rather than upsetting. Hey, maybe a chance to find out about a new phenomenon. Yes? If they're impelled instead of propelled, there'd be no sonic boom. I don't understand the first part of that. What do you mean by impelled?
They were drawn by a force in front of them instead of propelled by a force driving them. There would be no sonic boom.
All right, I'll buy that, I guess.
No, a force.
Where's the force come from?
If we would neutralize gravity, I know I'm talking in generalities, but if we would neutralize gravity, and if it was something pushing it, but not a propellant, would there necessarily be a sonic boom?
I don't know. I mean, like if you had the equivalent of having a big magnet over here and pulling something towards you. I think you'd still get a sonic boom unless you controlled the flow around the object. I'm not saying you can't use anti-gravity, incidentally. It's been a very exciting development down at the University of Texas, theoretically at least. Under certain special conditions, they found a repulsive component for gravity. That doesn't mean a hateful component. It means that under certain conditions, instead of everything attracting everything else, mass pushes something away. That's really far out, but if you had that, boy, what a propulsion system you'd have. Yes? Not really, although some of the ancient artifacts that are around, who knows where they come from or how they were manufactured. Von Daniken gets into that in Chariots of the Gods and stuff. I know of no really good physical remains of UFOs. I've heard all kinds of story about the Air Force having such things, about craft having crashed, and a cordon of troops, put around and cart off something. I've heard that from many different sources. I've never been able to establish that it's true. That doesn't mean it isn't, but they ain't talking. So if they've got artifacts, they obviously have not put them on display and charged a buck admission. For the obvious reason that that's worth a fortune to anybody trying to build something. and what great weapons delivery systems these things would make. So I don't have anything I can put my mitts on anyway. Again, if I did, I don't suppose I'd be here. Yes? Is there usually electrical interference where UFOs land? I wouldn't put it quite that way. I would say there are many instances of interference with the operation of electrically controlled systems. Cars, as an obvious example. In Levelland, Texas, one night, 7 different people independently reported to the sheriff that a UFO had come near the car. All the systems had conked out. This is a big, glowing, egg-shaped craft. When it left, everything went back on again. And there are many other instances like that. But there are enough instances when UFOs come close to vehicles where they don't conk out that seems to be an intentional attempt to see whether a particular system of stopping vehicles works. There's one case in France where 2 tractors, one diesel, one normal, and the UFO comes near and the normal one conks out and the diesel one keeps going. And I can just picture the guy on board saying, "What did I do wrong? Back to the drawing board. My car stopper or my engine stopper doesn't work." So I would suspect that they work electromagnetically, but that the conking out is a direct effort on their part. Yes?
Based on the UFO sightings as being blunt edge or whatever, have they figured out what the optimum shape for travel in the atmosphere?
Well, it depends on how you want to travel in the atmosphere. I don't know that there is an optimum shape, but obviously we have decided on blunt bodies as the way to go at very high speed. I mean, all the re-entry capsules are blunt, the large ones. Yeah. But I think if you want to work by interacting with your surroundings, which UFOs seem to do, as opposed to an action-reaction exhaust. I mean, obviously, airplanes can't go forward and then backwards because they don't have an engine on the other side. But Volkswagens can go forwards and backwards because they interact with the surface on which they operate. Fish can go backwards and forward. Hummingbirds can go, because they work by interacting with their surroundings. So the round shape would seem to provide the symmetry of every direction being frontwards or forwards or backwards. Besides which, if they worked like the electromagnetic submarine that was built several years ago, you'd expect a round symmetric shape. So optimum, come back 10 years and ask me the question, and then we'll know maybe. Yes?
You mentioned the fact that if a car is stopped by an electromagnetic field, that is what you're saying, right? The car is stopped by this method?
That UFOs come near the car and the car's electrical system conks out.
Is it because of strong electromagnetic field?
Don't know. Nobody's had any instruments around to determine.
Okay, well, some people say that it is, and General Motors will come back and say that when your cars are produced, they're pounded out, and like the door is pounded out to a big machine, then a magnetic field is produced in this car. You can take a compass and map the magnetic field.
That's a DC field.
Right. So therefore, if an electromagnetic field had stopped this car, or if the car was in a strong electromagnetic field, why wouldn't it be altered?
It might very well be. The tests that have been run on cars that have been stopped by UFOs have been very minimal, but that's a DC field. If they're using an AC field, microwaves, radar beams, whatever, then it won't produce the same effect at all. There's a frequency response to the system. And this is discussed in the Condon report in one section of it. They never get into the question of AC fields, which is very strange, because that's what you'd expect them to use. So this is one of the puzzles that should be looked at in much more detail. It'd be worth a fortune if you had a system for stopping a car at a distance. Every police force, every army, every air force would love to get a hold of it. Every crook, too, I suspect, how to stop the police car that's chasing you. I've heard other rumors about people playing with radar beams out windows of a laboratory in California and pointing them at cars and the cars stopping. Haven't tried it myself. Somebody here got a good radar set? Have fun. That's a terrible thing to suggest. Forget that. Yes? Am I familiar with the Men in Black idea in some of the UFO articles and stuff? Yeah, I've read them. I don't buy it very much. These are reports that Everybody who has a good sighting gets visited by 3 mysterious strangers in black outfits, usually black suits, sort of oriental cast features, drive up in a big black Cadillac, threaten the people, and so forth. I know of a couple instances where something like this has occurred, but I don't think it's an important part of the phenomenon, the total picture. And I even had my own Men in Black experience, if you will. I was at a meeting where people, it was going to last a couple days. Some people wanted to take me out to lunch. It was a UFO thing. They wanted to take me out to lunch the next day. They call up. They arrange it. They drive up in a big black Cadillac. 3 guys get out, all in black suits. It was perfect, except we had a delightful lunch and there were no threats, no nothing. So I think that some of the writers of that sort of stuff have overactive imaginations. Some of these same guys have written articles about the mysterious deaths of people involved in UFO studies. And there's at least 4 or 5 guys who are known authorities, so to speak, who have died. Except I've checked all those deaths and there wasn't anything mysterious about any of those deaths. You know, you take any 1,000 people and 9 of them are going to be dead at the end of the year. At the end of 10 years, 90 of them. What would really be amazing if nobody involved in UFO investigations had died. Then you'd have to say something peculiar had happened. So, you know, imagination is nice, but it shouldn't be used to replace reality. Yeah, some people have suggested, of course, that the Men in Black are CIA guys or Air Force guys or extraterrestrials or subterrestrials, or there's a long list. The Air Force denies that they're there, that they're theirs. Of course they would. The CIA doesn't say anything about anything. The others haven't said anything either way. So no, I don't know who they are, if they are, or why they are. Yes? Do I personally? I haven't tried to utilize them. This is a group at the Smithsonian Laboratory, I guess. Is that the right name for it? I guess it is. At Harvard. And they study all sorts of short-lived phenomena, from plagues of one sort or another to earthquakes to other such things. There is a thing called the Volunteer Flight Officers Network, Flight Observers Network. Airline pilots around the world cooperate, reporting typically re-entries. And they send their reports into the Center for Short-Lived Phenomena. I know the guy who coordinates VFON, and he has informed me that the center has, in no uncertain terms, told him they weren't interested in UFOs. I think that's the Harvard influence. Dr. Menzel, the guy I was talking about who explained away UFO sightings, is at the, or was head of the Smithsonian. And so, yeah. Wait a minute, I can't hear you. Talk louder. Yeah. No, it was 8 years after the event in the first place, and it was a cerebrovascular accident, a stroke. A weak point in a blood vessel, nothing mysterious whatsoever. No one, and I've talked to his wife, has attributed in any way, shape, or form to the UFO. If it had happened, you know, a week later, then maybe you'd say maybe. But in this case, no way to blame that on the UFO at all. Barney had some rather strange warts removed, which were apparently, from what came out later, associated with what took place on board the craft. And the doctor who removed them said, you know, the oddest warts he'd ever seen, but nobody kept those. No good physical examination. You see, the whole problem was that they didn't know about being taken on board until 2 years later, over 2 years later. So even the car, which apparently was affected and somebody touched a compass to it and it went crazy and stuff, that was let go too. It was gone. All one can think of, as I say, in listening to the tapes, is why didn't Dr. Simon ask the right questions at several points? Why wasn't this test run? Why wasn't that test run? And terribly frustrating. The next case we find out about, maybe we'll do it, do it right. Yes?
A kind of what? Oh, message. That's an interesting question. You mean, are they, making buy Coca-Cola in a flight pattern or something? The first one is that I'd put the first question the other way around. That is, you said when it's been reported that when cars or vehicles approach UFOs, there's interference with their propulsion system. I'd put it the other way around. When UFOs approach vehicles, sometimes there is definite interference with the vehicle's propulsion system, not the UFO's propulsion system. I mean, and not you going toward the UFO, but it coming toward you. In the book by Maney and Hall, and Maney was a professor of physics, they list 86 instances of this sort. So it's a fairly common phenomenon. In Wisconsin last winter, it happened to somebody. The water in his radiator boiled over also, and all his fuses blew when the UFO came near him. He didn't go near the UFO, it came near him. And many such reports of a light coming down from the UFO, touching the car, and everything conking out. And then, strange as it may sound, the light kind of going back up. Not suddenly on and off, but like you were withdrawing it, which sounds very strange too. Probably an effect associated with whatever the beam is rather than the beam itself. I'll buy the latter part of that, probably by means we know nothing about. We don't know. You see, there's a difference between the observable phenomena and the interpretation of that phenomena. There are planes that have been zapped by UFOs. What that means is hard to say, too. And planes that have had power failure problems. I know of one case, related sort of a group of Army crews firing 90-millimeter cannon. They spot a UFO downrange, and they argue, what should they do about it? Shoot at it, it finally gets decided. So they set their fuses for like 5.5 miles, magnetic fuses.